Sometimes we walk hand in hand by the sea, and we breathe in the cool, salty air.
BioShock Infinite Burial at Sea Episode 1 was released on November 12, 2013. Burial at Sea was the first of the 2 DLC packs released for BioShock Infinite. Instead of taking place in Columbia like BioShock Infinite, Burial at Sea takes place in the same setting as the first 2 BioShock games in the city of Rapture. This DLC pack can easily be split into 2 parts. The first third of the game is mostly plot and exploring, while the latter 2/3 of the game are more action-oriented. While entertaining, this DLC is brutally short. Burial at Sea's plot takes the main character of BioShock Infinite, Booker DeWitt, and places him in Rapture in 1959, 46 years after the events of BioShock Infinite. Booker, however, hasn't aged since the events of BioShock Infinite, so this game takes place in an alternate timeline than the timeline of Infinite. The plot eventually ties into Infinite near the end of the DLC, but leaves you with more questions than answers. I find it strange that they decided to tack on the title Episode 1 to Burial at Sea, because the game's plot can really stand alone and actually has an ending. The game takes place a year before the fall of Rapture. This gives you some interesting insight to the BioShock universe because it fills in several gaps in the previous games. It explains the origins of the Little Sisters and gives you some more background on the city of Rapture. I found myself really enjoying the first part of the game that consisted of exploring Rapture and talking to people. However, when I got to the action part of the DLC, I was far less interested because it felt a little too overly gamey, especially after having such a hardcore narrative for the first part of the game. This makes the pacing feel a little weird and made the combat pale in comparison to the exploration parts. The gameplay is identical to BioShock Infinite, except with an added stealth kill ability to your skyhook. This adds some stealthy encounters to the DLC and gives you more options on how you want to choose to play out the combat. The game does add a few puzzles that you'll use plasmids to solve, but it's more of a fetch quest than a puzzle. There's no real new enemies introduced here, and you'll find yourself gunning down splicers and eventually facing a Big Daddy. Graphically, this expansion looks pretty much as good as the main game. Elizabeth's new 50s outfit is neat, and Rapture looks as good as it ever did. The DLC unfortunately graphically lacks the diverse color palette that Infinite had, and is oversaturated with dark blues and greens. The soundtrack is mostly orchestral, however, it's not really that memorable. It generally suits the mood and adds to the scenes in the game, however, it's not something you'd want to listen to outside of the game. BioShock Infinite Burial at Sea costs $15, and unfortunately that price is way too high for what you get with this game. From start to finish, I beat this game in 1 hour and 15 minutes, and I wasn't even trying to rush through the game. This makes the game more expensive than seeing a movie, however it provides less content than most movies. There's also virtually no replayability because the game is so plot-centric. BioShock Infinite Burial at Sea is an interesting expansion that provides some backstory to the first 2 BioShock games. It feels somewhat out of place in terms of the Infinite storyline, but manages to pull it together in the end. The game is unfortunately way too short for its cost, and the plot is not good enough to validate the price. I would only recommend this DLC to die-hard BioShock fans.